The Gale. During that long and empty winter, darkness in our city reaped an enormous 100-fold harvest. The attics and storage rooms had been left cluttered up for too long, with old pots and pans stacked one on top of another, and batteries of discarded, empty bottles. There, in those charred, many-raftered forests of attics, darkness began to degenerate and ferment wildly. There began the black parliaments of saucepans, those verbose and inconclusive meetings, those gurglings of bottles, those stammerings of flagons. Until one night the regiments of saucepans and bottles rose under the empty roofs and marched in a great bulging mass against the city. The attics, now freed from their clutter, opened up their expanses. Through their echoing black aisles ran cavalcades of beams, formations of wooden trestles, kneeling on their knees of pine, now at last freed to fill the night with a clatter of rafters and the crash of purlins and crossbeams. Then the black rivers of tubs and water cans overflowed and swept through the night. Their black, shining, noisy concourse besieged the city. In the darkness, that mob of receptacles swarmed and pressed forward like an army of talkative fishes, a boundless invasion of garrulous pails and voluble buckets. Drumming on their sides, the barrels, buckets, and water cans rose in stacks. The earthenware jars gathered about. The old bowlers and opera hats climbed one on top of another, growing towards the sky in pillars, only to collapse at last. And all the while their wooden tongues rattled clumsily, while they ground out curses from their wooden mouths and spread blasphemies of mud over the whole area of the night, until at last these blasphemies achieved their object. Summoned by the creaking of utensils, by their fulsome chatter, there arrived the powerful caravans of wind and dominated the night. An enormous, black, moving amphitheatre formed high above the city and began to descend in powerful spirals. The darkness exploded in a great stormy gale and raged for 3 days and 3 nights. "You won't go to school today," said my mother in the morning. "There's a gale blowing." A delicate veil of resin-scented smoke filled the room. The stove roared and whistled, as if a whole pack of hounds or demons were held captive in it. The large face painted on its protruding belly made colourful grimaces, and its cheeks swelled dramatically. I ran barefoot to the window. The sky was swept lengthwise by the gusts of the wind. Vast and silvery white, it was cut into lines of energy tensed to breaking point, into awesome furrows like strata of tin and lead. Divided into magnetic fields and trembling with discharges, it was full of concealed electricity. The diagrams of the gale were traced on it, which, itself unseen and elusive, loaded the landscape with its power. One could not see the gale. One could recognize its effect on the houses, on the roofs under which its fury penetrated. One after the other, the attics seemed to loom larger and to explode in madness when touched by its finger. It swept the squares clean, leaving behind it a white emptiness in the streets. It denuded the whole area of the marketplace. Only here and there a lonely man bent under the force of the wind could be seen clinging to the corner of a house. The whole market square seemed to shine like a bald head under the powerful gusts of wind. The gale blew cold and dead colours onto the sky, streaks of green, yellow and violet, the distant vaults and arcades of its spirals. The roofs loomed black and crooked, apprehensive and expectant. Those under which the wind had already penetrated rose in inspiration, outgrew the neighbouring roofs, and prophesied doom under the unkempt sky. Then they fell and expired, unable to hold any longer the powerful breath, which then moved further along and filled the whole space with noise and terror. And yet more houses rose with a scream in a paroxysm of prediction, and howled disaster. The enormous beech trees around the church stood with their arms upraised like witnesses of terrifying visions, and screamed and screamed. Farther along, beyond the roofs of Market Square, I saw the gable ends and the naked walls of suburban houses. They climbed one over the other and grew paralysed with fear. The distant, cold, red glare painted them in autumnal colours. We did not have our midday meal that day, because the fire in the range belched circles of smoke into the kitchen. All the rooms were cold and smelled of wind. About 2:00 in the afternoon, a fire broke out in the suburbs and spread rapidly. My mother and Adela began to pack our bedding, fur coats and valuables. Night came. The wind, intensified in force and violence, grew immeasurably and filled the whole area. It had now stopped visiting the houses and roofs and had started to build a many-storied, multi-level spiral over the city, a black maze, growing relentlessly upwards. From that maze it shot out along galleries of rooms, raced amid claps of thunder through long corridors, and then allowed all those imaginary structures to collapse, spreading out and rising into the formless stratosphere. Our rooms trembled gently. The pictures rattled on the walls. The window panes shone with the greasy reflection of the lamp. The curtains swelled with the breath of that stormy night. We suddenly remembered that we had not seen Father since the morning. He must have gone out very early to the shop, where the gale had probably surprised him and cut him off from home. "He will not have had anything to eat all day," Mother wailed. The senior shop assistant, Theodore, volunteered to venture into the wind-swept night to take some food to Father. My brother decided to go with him. Wrapped in large bearskin coats, they filled their pockets with flat irons and brass pestles, metal ballast to prevent them from being blown away by the gale. The door leading into the night was opened cautiously. No sooner had Theodore and my brother taken one step into the darkness than they were swallowed up by the night on the very threshold of the house. The wind immediately washed away all traces of their departure. From the window one could not see the light of the lantern which they had taken. Having swallowed them, the wind quietened down for a while. Adela and Mother again tried to light a fire in the kitchen range. All the matches went out, and through the opened access door, ashes and soot were blown all over the room. We stood behind the front door of the house and listened. In the lament of the gale one could hear all kinds of voices, questions, calls and cries. We imagined that we could hear Father lost in the gale calling for help, or else that it was my brother and Theodore chatting unconcernedly outside the door. The sounds were so deceptive that Adela opened the door at one point, and in fact saw Theodore and my brother just emerging, with great effort, from the gale in which they had sunk up to their armpits. They came in panting, and closed the door with difficulty behind them. For a moment they had to lean against it, so strong was the storming of the wind at the entrance. At last they got the door bolted, and the wind continued its chase elsewhere. They spoke almost incoherently of the terrible darkness, of the gale. Their fur coats, soaked with wind, now smelled of the open air. They blinked in the light. Their eyes, still full of night, spilled darkness at each flutter of the eyelids. They could not reach the shop, they said. They had lost their way and hardly knew how to get back. The city was unrecognizable, and all the streets looked as if they'd been displaced. My mother suspected that they were not telling the truth. In fact, we all had the impression that they had perhaps stood under our windows for a few minutes without attempting to go anywhere. Or perhaps the city and the marketplace had ceased to exist, and the gale and the night had surrounded our house with dark stage props and some machinery to imitate the howling, whistling, and groaning. Perhaps these enormous and mournful spaces suggested by the wind did not exist. Perhaps there were no vast labyrinths, nor spirals, no windowed corridors to form a long black flute on which the wind played its tunes. We were increasingly inclined to think that the gale was only an invention of the night, a poor representation on a confined stage of the tragic immensity, the cosmic homelessness and loneliness of the wind. Our front door now opened time after time to admit visitors wrapped tightly in capes and shawls. A breathless neighbour or friend would slowly shed his outer wrappings and throw out confused and unconnected words which fantastically exaggerated the dangers of the night. We all sat together in the brightly lit kitchen. Behind the kitchen range and the black broad eaves of the chimney, a few steps led to the attic door. On these steps Theodore now sat, listening to the attic shaking in the wind. He heard how, during the pauses between gusts, the bellows of the rafters folded themselves into pleats, and the roof hung limply like an enormous lung from which air had escaped. Then again how it inhaled, stretched out the rafters, grew like a Gothic vault, and resounded like the box of an enormous double bass. And then we forgot the gale. Adela started pounding cinnamon in a mortar. Aunt Perazia had come to call, small, vivacious, and very active, with the lace of her black shawl on her head. She began to bustle about the kitchen, helping Adela, who by then had plucked a cockerel. Aunt Perazia put a handful of paper in the grate and lit it. Adela grasped the cockerel by its neck and held it over the flames to scorch off the remaining feathers. The bird suddenly spread its wings in the fire, crowed once, and was burned. At that, Aunt Perazia began to shout and curse. Trembling with anger, she shook her fists at Adela and at Mother. I could not understand what it was all about, but she persisted in her anger and became one small bundle of gestures and imprecations. It seemed that in her paroxysm of fury she might disintegrate into separate gestures, that she would divide into 100 spiders, would spread out over the floor in a black shimmering net of crazy running cockroaches. Instead, she began suddenly to shrink and dwindle, still shaking and spitting curses. And then she trotted off, hunched and small, into a corner of the kitchen where we stacked the firewood, and cursing and coughing, began feverishly to rummage among the sonorous wood, until she found 2 thin yellow splinters. She grabbed them with trembling hands, measured them against her legs, then raised herself on them as if they were stilts, and began to walk about, clattering on the floor, jumping here and there across the slanting lines of the floorboards, quicker and quicker, until she finished up on a pine bench, whence she climbed on the shelf with the crockery, a tinkling wooden shelf running the whole length of the kitchen wall. She ran along it on her stilts, and shrank away into a corner. She became smaller and smaller, black and folded like a wilted, charred sheet of paper, oxidized into a petal of ash, disintegrating into dust and nothingness. We all stood helpless in the face of this display of self-destructive fury. With regret we observed the sad course of the paroxysm, and with some relief returned to our occupations when the lamentable process had spent itself. Adela clanked the mortar again, pounding cinnamon. Mother returned to her interrupted conversation, and Theodore, listening to the prophecies in the attic, made comical faces, lifting his eyebrows and softly chuckling to himself.